The boy standing on the auction block had the exact same steel-gray eyes as the man holding the leash. He wasn't just a slave, he was the planter's own flesh and blood. As the bidding war screamed past $1,000, the father didn't look away in shame. He smiled. He wasn't losing a son, he was cashing in a high-yield investment. This is the story of how the American dream was built on the ultimate betrayal. American South in the middle of the 19th century did not smell of magnolias and starched crinolines, regardless of the lies spun by sentimental novelists and revisionist historians. It reeked of stagnant urine, cheap tobacco, horse sweat, and the sickly sweet stench of gangrene that clung to the humid air like a second skin. This was not a civilization in the classical sense, built on marble and philosophy. It was a giant, bloated cellular structure swollen with greed, a biological engine where one set of organisms devoured another to secrete the fibrous white gold known as cotton. The landscape itself seemed complicit in this slow-motion atrocity, a flat and heat-stroke-inducing expanse where the sun acted less like a celestial body and more like a merciless foreman. The heat was a physical weight, a wet wool blanket that smothered breath and turned human skin into a slick of salt and grime within minutes of stepping outdoors. There was no romance in the red clay that stained boots and hemlines the color of dried blood, nor in the mosquitoes that swarmed in clouds thick enough to choke a man, carrying fevers that burned the mind out of the skull. At the center of this food chain stood the planter, a figure traditionally depicted in oil paintings as a noble patriarch clutching a crystal glass of bourbon on a breezeless veranda. In the cold light of reality, he was nothing more than a mediocre middle manager, a frantic speculator whose ledger book was metaphorically bound in human skin and whose ink was mixed with the blood of the disenfranchised. He was not a king, he was a debtor, perpetually chasing the fluctuating numbers on the Liverpool and New York exchanges, terrified of the telegraph wires that brought news of price drops. When the economic indicators fell, when the soil turned gray and exhausted from overplanting, and when the debts to the merchant banks in the north began to metastasize like a cancer, the facade of southern chivalry crumbled instantly. The grand architecture of the plantation house, with its white columns and manicured lawns, was merely a theatrical set designed to hide the rot in the foundation. Behind the velvet curtains and the mahogany doors, the air was thick with the anxiety of impending bankruptcy, a fear that smelled of stale alcohol and sleepless nights. To survive the mathematical brutality of the market, this patriarch would eventually resort to the oldest and most vile form of cannibalism known to the species. He would begin to consume his own offspring. This was the open secret of the aristocracy, the ghost that rattled chains in the nursery and the slave quarters alike. It was a biological reality that everyone saw but no one acknowledged over the dinner table, a taboo that was rendered invisible by a conspiracy of silence and profit. On any large plantation, the evidence of this moral decomposition ran barefoot across the dust of the back courtyard, tangling under the hooves of the livestock. These were the children born of violence, the byproducts of the master's nocturnal visits to the slave cabins, living, breathing evidence of adultery and systemic rape. They were not viewed as sons or daughters, nor even as human beings with a claim to the family name. They were assets, entries in an inventory, investments with a delayed maturity date. The genetic lottery often played a cruel joke on these estates, producing children who bore the undeniable stamp of their father's lineage. A boy might sprint past the kitchen house with skin the color of cream coffee, but with the exact aquiline nose of the man sitting in the library. A girl might look up from a wash basin with eyes the startling shade of steel gray or cornflower blue, the precise irises that stared out from the family portraits hanging in the hallway. These features, which should have incited paternal instinct, instead triggered a cold, mercantile calculation. The planter's wife viewed these children with a hatred that was visceral and all-consuming, seeing in their faces a living insult to her honor and a constant reminder of her husband's infidelity. She did not see a child, she saw a stain on her domestic empire, a creature that mocked the sanctity of her marriage vows with every breath it took. Her pressure on the patriarch was relentless, a whispering campaign in the bedroom demanding that the filth be removed from her sight, that the evidence of his sins be liquidated to restore order to the household. For the master, however, the calculation was less emotional and more akin to a livestock breeder assessing his herd for the slaughterhouse. In his world, blood kinship ended precisely where the property line began, and his own flesh and blood were legally classified as chattel. He looked at his mixed-race son and did not see a heir, he saw $600 walking on two legs. He looked at his daughter, with her light skin and European features, and saw a premium luxury good that would fetch a high price in the specialized markets of New Orleans. The decision to sell was rarely made in a fit of passion. It was made at a desk, surrounded by piles of overdue bills and threatening letters from creditors. It was a bureaucratic act, the scratching of a pen on parchment, transferring a living soul from the assets column to the liquidated column. The father would sip his drink, wipe the sweat from his forehead with a linen handkerchief, and convince himself that he was merely making a necessary business adjustment, a rationalization that severed the final nerve of his humanity. The preparation for the market was a grotesque parody of parental care, stripped of all affection and replaced by the harsh utility of product enhancement. The children were not dressed for a family outing, they were groomed for inspection, washed and fed to ensure they looked healthy enough to withstand the scrutiny of strangers. The father, who had given them life and the color of their eyes, would inspect them not to ensure their well-being, but to check for defects that might lower their auction value. There was no devastating goodbye, no tearful explanation of why the world was ending, because to explain would be to admit a relationship that the law and society pretended did not exist. The journey began in the pre-dawn gray, the air heavy with mist and silence, as the father ordered his own children into the back of a wagon or tied them to a coffle line like stray dogs. The silence was absolute, broken only by the jingle of the harness and the soft thud of hooves on the damp earth. They moved away from the only home they had ever known, heading toward the river ports where the steamboats waited like leviathans to swallow them whole. The father rode ahead, his back stiff, his eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to look back at the cargo he was hauling. He was transporting equity to the marketplace, converting the biology of his loins into the hard currency needed to buy more land, more seed, and more iron shackles. This was the true face of the era, stripped of the romantic myths of honor and gentility. It was a system where the laws of economics superseded the laws of nature, where a man could look into eyes that mirrored his own and see only a commodity to be traded. The wagon wheels churned through the mud, carrying the weight of a betrayal so profound that it stained the soul of the nation, a sin that no amount of whitewash could ever cover. The father drove the team, and behind him, the children watched his back, waiting for a salvation that would never come, marching steadily toward the gavel that would price their existence in dollars and cents. On any large plantation, beneath the veneer of genteel hospitality and the rhythmic chanting of the field gangs, there existed a secret that festered like an infected wound. It was a secret known to every soul on the property, from the head driver to the lowliest scullery maid, yet it was the one subject that was strictly forbidden from crossing the threshold of the dining room. This secret did not hide in the shadows of the swamp or the locked attic, it ran openly across the packed dirt of the backyard, tangling under the feet of the livestock and the laundry women. These were the children born of the violence committed by the master against the bodies of his enslaved women, living, breathing evidence of a moral rot that no amount of whitewash could conceal. They were the biological byproducts of a system that granted one man absolute dominion over the flesh of another, a system where the boundaries between sexuality, violence, and economics were not just blurred but entirely erased. The presence of these children was a constant, low-level radiation that poisoned the domestic air. They were ubiquitous in the service areas, scrambling for scraps near the smokehouse or hauling water to the kitchen, their existence a testament to the master's nocturnal wanderings. However, for the owner of the estate, these small human beings were something entirely different from a source of shame. To his calculating eye, they were assets. They were investments with a delayed maturity date, dividends paid out by the peculiar institution of chattel slavery. In the twisted logic of the plantation economy, the rape of a slave woman was not merely a crime of passion or power, it was an act of capital accumulation. The child that resulted from such a union was a net increase in the master's wealth, a piece of property that cost nothing to acquire save for the minimal expense of food and shelter required to keep it alive until it was old enough to work or be sold. The genetic lottery, however, often played a cruel and ironic joke on these patriarchs of the Cotton Kingdom. Biology, indifferent to the rigid color lines established by society and law, frequently asserted itself with startling clarity. A child would be born not with the features of the mother, but as a near-perfect replica of the father. These children, often referred to as mulattoes, quadroons, or octoroons depending on the fraction of African blood they possessed, walked the plantation grounds as living mirrors. They bore the master's aquiline nose, his stubborn jawline, the specific arch of his eyebrows, and, most hauntingly, his eyes. It was a grotesque spectacle to witness a boy in ragged burlap trousers, his feet caked in mud and manure, looking up with eyes the same piercing shade of slate gray or cornflower blue as the men sipping brandy on the veranda. For the planter's wife, these children were not assets, they were a torment. She viewed them with a hatred that was visceral, ancient, and all-consuming. Every time she looked out her window and saw a child with her husband's face playing in the dust among the chickens, she felt a fresh stab of humiliation. They were the living insults to her honor, the undeniable proof of her husband's infidelity and the hollowness of their marriage vows. In the rigid social structure of the South, she was powerless to stop her husband's indiscretions, and she was equally powerless to divorce him without facing social ruin. Her rage, having no outlet against the perpetrator, turned inward and then projected outward onto the innocent results of the sin. She despised these children not for what they did, but for what they were. She saw them as unnatural, as mongrel invaders who mocked the purity of her own lineage. This hatred often manifested in petty, grinding cruelties. The mistress of the house would go out of her way to ensure that these specific children were given the hardest chores, the scantiest rations, and the severest punishments. She would demand that they be kept out of her sight, banished to the farthest edges of the quarters, yet she would obsessively watch them from behind the lace curtains, searching for the resemblance that she prayed would fade but which only grew sharper with time. If a child looked too much like the master, if the texture of their hair was too soft or their skin too pale, the wife's revulsion would deepen into a dangerous mania. She would pressure her husband, whispering venom in the sanctuary of their bedroom, demanding that the creature be sent away, sold down the river, erased from the narrative of their respectable Christian lives. She did not plead for the child's welfare, she pleaded for the restoration of her own delusions, asking that the living evidence of the plantation's dirty underbelly be converted into currency and removed from the premises. The master, sitting in his study surrounded by leather-bound books and the smell of stale pipe tobacco, listened to these complaints with the weariness of a man managing a difficult employee. He did not share his wife's emotional turbulence. To him, the child was not a symbol of sin, nor was it a person with a claim to his affection. It was a line item. He looked at the situation through the lens of a spreadsheet. On one side was domestic tranquility and the cessation of his wife's shrill nagging, on the other was the current market value of a light-skinned adolescent in the booming slave marts of the Deep South. In his world, blood kinship ended precisely where the property line began. The law of the land, the brutal doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, stated that the child followed the condition of the mother. It mattered not one whit that the blood pumping through the boy's veins was the same blood that had flowed in the veins of the founding fathers. If the womb that bore him was black and enslaved, the child was black and enslaved. The father could look at his own nose on the boy's face and feel no biological pull, only the satisfaction of a manufacturer noting a high-quality product. This detachment was necessary, for the economics of the plantation were a harsh taskmaster. By the 1850s, the soil in the Upper South was growing tired, exhausted by decades of tobacco and cotton monoculture. The old wealth was fading, eaten away by erosion and poor management. The true wealth of the planter class was no longer in the dirt, but in the bodies they owned. The internal slave trade had become a multi-million-dollar industry, a vampiric circulatory system that pumped human life from the declining states of Virginia and Maryland to the hungry, expanding cotton hells of Mississippi and Louisiana. In this context, the master's illegitimate children were his most liquid assets. When the bank notes came due, when the factor in New Orleans demanded payment for last year's supplies, the planter did not sell his land or his horses first. He sold the surplus labor. And the most valuable surplus, the items that fetched a premium price due to their scarcity and quality, were the children who carried the visible stamp of white ancestry. He would often observe the child from a distance, not with the pride of a parent, but with the critical eye of a stockman. He would watch a daughter of 12 or 13 sweeping the porch, noting the straightness of her spine, the delicacy of her features, and the lightness of her complexion. He was not admiring her, he was appraising her. He knew that in the specialized fancy girl markets of New Orleans, such a girl could command a price of $2,000 or more. That sum was astronomical, enough to buy hundreds of acres of land or dozens of field hands. The perverse irony was that the very traits he had passed down to her, his skin, his features, his aristocratic bearing, were the attributes that condemned her. They made her a fetish object for other wealthy white men, a prize to be won at auction. The father knew exactly what fate awaited a girl sold into that market. He knew she would be purchased for the exclusive purpose of sexual gratification. Yet, he could rationalize this with a breathtaking cynicism. He would tell himself that she would have an easier life as a concubine in a city townhouse than picking cotton under the lash in the Delta sun. He twisted his betrayal into a grotesque act of mercy. For the sons, the calculation was different but equally cold. A boy with white blood was often seen as more intelligent, more tractable, or better suited for domestic service or skilled trade. He could be sold as a butler, a carriage driver, or a craftsman's apprentice. The father would test the boy's temper, check his teeth, and feel the muscles in his arms, ensuring that the merchandise was sound. There was no hesitation in his touch, no tremor of guilt. The ideology of the time had successfully severed the link between biology and humanity. The master had been raised to believe that the one-drop rule was a scientific reality. A single drop of African blood polluted the whole, rendering the subject subhuman and therefore saleable. It was a mental fortress that allowed him to sell his own flesh and blood to pay for the crystal chandelier that hung in his foyer, without ever losing a minute of sleep. The process of bringing the child to market began long before the auction block. It started in the ledger books. The master would sit at his desk late into the night, the oil lamp casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. He would dip his pen in ink and scratch out the calculations. He listed his debts on the left, the mortgage on the new acreage, the bill for the imported silk dresses his wife demanded, the gambling losses from the last trip to the city. On the right, he listed his inventory. He would run his finger down the list of names, Isaac, Sarah, Big Jim, Little Jim, until he stopped at the name of the child he had fathered. He would write a number next to it, a speculative figure based on the latest market reports. The scratching of the pen was the sound of a soul being weighed and found wanting. Once the math balanced, the decision was irrevocable. The emotional connection, if there ever was one, was cauterized by the necessity of solvency. The betrayal was most profound in its silence. There was no dramatic confrontation where the father explained the economic realities to the son. There was only the quiet machinery of betrayal grinding into motion. The master would make arrangements with a slave trader or prepare to make the journey himself. He would order the child to be given new clothes, not out of kindness, but to improve the presentation. A clean shirt and a pair of trousers could add $50 to the final hammer price. The child, naive and desperate for any sign of favor from the big house, might mistake this attention for affection. The boy might puff out his chest, proud of his new shirt, thinking that finally, the great man on the hill had noticed him. He did not know that he was being dressed for his own funeral, that the shirt was essentially the packaging for a product about to be shipped. On the eve of the departure, the plantation would settle into an uneasy quiet. The enslaved community often knew what was coming. The grapevine of the quarters was faster and more accurate than any telegraph. They would look at the child with eyes full of pity and sorrow, muttering prayers that the master's God would never hear. But they said nothing to the victim. What was the point of destroying the boy's last night of peace? Meanwhile, in the main house, the master dined on roast pork and corn pudding, discussing politics and the threat of northern abolitionists with his guests. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, laughed at a joke, and poured another glass of wine. The child he was about to sell was sleeping 100 yards away on a cornhusk mattress, but in the father's mind, the transaction was already complete. The boy had already been converted into gold, all that remained was the logistics of delivery. The physical reality of the morning of departure was stripped of all sentiment. It was a business trip. The master rose before dawn, dressed in his traveling clothes, and checked his saddlebags. He carried a pistol, not for fear of the child, but for fear of road agents who might steal his valuable cargo. He walked to the quarters not as a father, but as a sheriff executing a warrant. When he called the child's name, his voice was flat, devoid of inflection. The boy, rubbing sleep from his eyes that mirrored the master's own, stumbled out into the cool morning air. He saw the wagon, the horses, and the supplies. He might have smiled, thinking he was being taken on a trip, a rare adventure. The father did not return the smile. He gestured to the wagon bed. There were no shackles used at this stage. The psychological chains of obedience and the confusion of the moment were strong enough bindings. The child climbed up, trusting the men who held the reins, trusting the blood that they shared. As the wagon rolled away from the plantation, the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting a red light across the fields of cotton that stretched to the ends of the earth. The wheels crunched over the gravel, a rhythmic, grinding sound that marked the passage of time and distance. The father did not look back at the house, nor did he look at the child sitting behind him. He kept his eyes fixed forward, on the road to the river, on the road to the market. He was a man of his time, a rational actor in an irrational system, doing what was necessary to maintain his station in life. He had successfully performed the ultimate alchemical trick of the American South. He had transmuted his own sin into profit, and he felt nothing but the morning chill and the anticipation of the deal to come. The biological imperative to protect one's offspring had been surgically removed and replaced by the imperative of the ledger. The wagon disappeared into the morning mist, carrying a father who had ceased to be human and a son who had ceased to be a person, both heading toward the auction block where the final price of their souls would be determined. The journey toward the marketplace of human flesh began at the break of dawn, in that gray and spectral hour when the mist still clung heavily to the fields, obscuring the jagged ugliness of reality. This was not the start of a family excursion or a grand tour of the countryside. It was a logistical operation, the transportation of high-value cargo from the point of production to the point of sale. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of wet earth, a suffocating blanket that dampened sound and made the world feel claustrophobic. The plantation house, usually a beacon of whitewashed authority, stood silent and ghostly in the rear view, its windows dark like the empty sockets of a skull. There was no fanfare, no waving handkerchiefs from the porch, only the nervous stamping of horses and the metallic clink of harness chains being tightened by hands that trembled slightly, not from emotion, but from the morning chill. The father, who in this specific narrative acted solely in the capacity of the vendor, rode ahead. He sat high on a gelding or perhaps lounged in the seat of a light gig, wrapped in a heavy traveling coat to ward off the dampness. He made a conscious, almost fastidious effort to keep his boots clear of the road's filth, checking his gloves for spots of mud with the vanity of a man who believes his station places him above the dirt of the earth. He was the architect of the expedition, the navigator who held the map and the bill of sale in his breast pocket, close to his heart. His posture was rigid, his eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to acknowledge the biological reality trailing in his wake. To look back would be to invite a moment of hesitation, and the market had no patience for hesitant men. Behind him, separated by a few yards of churned mud that might as well have been an ocean, followed his son or daughter. They were his flesh and blood, carrying his genetic code in every cell, yet they traveled as freight. They often walked, tethered in a coffle with other surplus laborers, or if they were particularly valuable, fancy stock, they sat in the back of a rough wagon designed for hauling feed sacks and farm tools. The wagon had no springs, and every rut in the road sent a jarring shock through their spines, a physical reminder of their powerlessness. They sat amidst the smell of ox manure and rusted iron, watching the back of the men who had given them life. It was a view of the father they would come to know intimately, the broad set of the shoulders, the collar of the coat, the indifference of a back turned against them. There were no tearful goodbyes, no melodramatic embraces that the theater loves to portray. Such displays presumed a relationship of equals, a bond that could be broken. Here, there was only the silence of absolute betrayal. The lack of words was heavier than any scream. The child did not ask where they were going because the answer was written in the very air, in the terrified whispers of the slave quarters they were leaving behind. They knew that the road led away from the only stability they had ever known and toward a void. For the child, this dawn marked the collapse of their entire universe, the shattering of the fragile illusion that their blood connection to the master might offer some shield against the brutality of the world. For the father, it was simply a Tuesday, a necessary morning of balancing the books, of converting a depreciating asset into solvent capital. As the sun began to burn through the mist, the heat of the south rose with a vengeance, turning the road into a baking oven. The red clay dust, fine and penetrating, coated everything in a layer of grime that looked disturbingly like dried blood. It settled in the creases of the father's coat and in the hair of the child, unifying them in filth even as the law separated them by caste. The journey was a physical ordeal, a slow grinding down of the spirit. The wagon wheels squeaked with a monotonous, rhythmic torture, a sound that would echo in the child's nightmares for decades. The landscape they passed was monotonous and hostile, endless rows of cotton and cane, impenetrable walls of pine forest, and the occasional swamp that smelled of decay and ancient, stagnant water. It was a landscape that did not care about human suffering, a vast biological machine that thrived on heat and death. The father stopped occasionally to water the horses, treating the animals with a solicitous care that was grotesque in its contrast to his treatment of the child. He would wipe the foam from the horse's mouth and check its hooves for stones. Only after the beast was attended to would he toss a canteen or a ladle of tepid water to the human cargo in the wagon. He did not do this out of cruelty, but out of a complete compartmentalization of his mind. The horse was a tool of transport, the child was a unit of sale. Both needed to be maintained, but the horse required his immediate agency. He avoided eye contact during these stops. If the child's eyes, Those startling, familiar eyes met his, he would look past them, focusing on a distant tree or a cloud formation, anything to avoid the recognition of a soul that he was in the process of murdering for profit. They were bound for the great cities of the trade, for New Orleans or Charleston, those shining abscesses on the body of the continent. These cities were the digestive organs of the slave economy, places where human dignity was consumed and excreted as gold and silver. To get there, the journey often transitioned from the dirt road to the river. The Mississippi or the harbor waters were the arteries of this system. Boarding a steamboat was a descent into a new circle of hell. The father would purchase a cabin ticket for himself, ascending to the upper decks where the air was moved by breezes and where orchestras played waltzes to drown out the groans from below. The child was sent to the steerage or the cargo deck, forced to huddle among crates of merchandise and livestock, breathing in the soot from the smokestacks and the stench of unwashed bodies. On the river, the separation became vertical. The father walked the promenade deck, smoking a cigar, discussing the price of sugar and the threat of northern aggression with other gentlemen who were on similar errands. They were a fraternity of Judases, each man carrying his own betrayal in his pocket, yet they spoke only of politics and economics. Below them, separated by thin planks of wood, their children lay in the darkness, feeling the vibrations of the massive paddle wheels that churned the water like a thrasher. The river was a brown, serpentine monster that swallowed the land and the people, carrying them inexorably southward, deeper into the heart of the Cotton Kingdom, further away from any hope of redemption. The sound of the steam whistle screaming in the night was the voice of the industrial age announcing its indifference to individual tragedy. For the child, the journey was a kaleidoscope of terror and confusion. Every mile put distance between them and their mother, who had been left behind to weep in the dust or, more likely, ordered back to the fields before the wagon was even out of sight. The child's mind raced, trying to understand the crime they had committed to deserve this exile. Was it their laugh? Was it the way they had looked at the mistress? They could not comprehend that their crime was their very existence, their biological reality as a living receipt of a transaction the father wished to annul. They watched the banks of the river slide by, a green wall of willows and cypress, realizing that the world was vast and they were terrifyingly small. The concept of home was evaporating, replaced by the terrifying fluidity of being a commodity in transit. As they approached the city, the atmosphere changed. The air became thicker, heavy with the smells of coal smoke, spices, open sewers, and millions of people living in close proximity. The skyline of New Orleans or Charleston would rise from the marshes like a mirage, a cluster of steeples and domes that promised civilization but delivered only a more refined form of barbarism. To the father, these spires meant relief, they signaled the end of the journey and the proximity of the auction block. He would begin to calculate the final preparations. He would inspect the child more closely now, not with affection, but with the anxiety of a merchant checking fruit for bruises. He might order them to wash the road dust from their faces or change into the clean shirt he had packed, knowing that presentation was everything in the theater of the sale. The arrival at the port was an assault on the senses. The docks were a chaotic swarm of stevedores, sailors, traders, and clerks. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of shouting voices in a dozen languages, the clatter of drays on cobblestones, the ringing of bells. The father navigated this chaos with the confidence of a man who belonged, guiding his property through the crowd. He moved toward the hotel rotundas or the specialized slave pens, places that were designed to strip the last vestiges of humanity from the incoming stock. The child, overwhelmed by the sensory overload, would shrink inward, their eyes wide with panic, searching for the father's figure not for comfort, but because he was the only familiar anchor in a sea of strangers. They walked through streets lined with beautiful pastel-colored houses with ironwork balconies, structures built on the backs of the very trade they were about to enter. The beauty of the architecture was a mask, a facade that hid the dungeons and the whipping posts located in the courtyards. The father led the way to the holding pens, often located ominously close to the finest hotels. Here, the final transaction of the journey would take place, the handover to the broker or the jailer who would house the child until the auction day. This was the moment the physical proximity ended. The father would sign a paper, hand over a few coins for board and keep, and turn to leave. In that final moment of the journey, standing in the shadow of the auction house, the true nature of the relationship was laid bare. The child looked at the father, perhaps one last time expecting a gesture of regret, a waver in the mask of command. But the father was already thinking of the hotel bar, of a hot bath, of the dinner he would order to celebrate his arrival. He was thinking of the debt he would pay off with the proceeds. He saw the child not as a son or daughter to be hugged, but as a burden that had been successfully delivered. The journey had been a process of shedding weight, of cutting away the rotting limb of his conscience. He turned his back, and the heavy iron door of the pen slammed shut, a sound that rang with the finality of a coffin lid closing. The trip was over, the sale was about to begin. The road had done its work, scrubbing away the illusion of family and leaving only the cold, hard equation of supply and demand. The St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans stood as the grand cathedral of the Southern economy, a magnificent architectural shell designed to sanctify the barbarism occurring within its walls. The famous rotunda, a soaring dome that filtered the harsh Louisiana sun into a soft, golden haze, was not merely a meeting place for society, it was the trading floor of a biological stock market. Here, under the elegant frescoes and amidst the echoes of polished marble, the auction block served as the altar for a religion based entirely on profit. The atmosphere was a disorienting blend of high society sophistication and the visceral, sweaty reality of a cattle market. It smelled of expensive Havana cigars, the stale aroma of champagne from the previous night, the starch of linen suits, and the underlying, inescapable musk of fear and unwashed bodies that rose from the holding pens nearby. This was a place where the concept of humanity was suspended by mutual agreement, replaced by the cold calculus of the ledger. The noise was a constant, low-frequency hum, a mixture of polite conversation, the scratching of pens, and the sharp rap of the auctioneer's gavel. It was a sound that absorbed individual screams and turned them into background ambition. The men who gathered here were not cartoon villains with twirled mustaches, they were the pillars of the community, judges, senators, and merchants, men with impeccable manners who tipped their hats to ladies and spoke of honor in hushed, reverent tones. Yet, they walked the floor with the detached, clinical gaze of butchers inspecting sides of beef, their eyes scanning for muscle density, reproductive viability, and signs of disease. The potential buyers moved through the aisles of human merchandise with a terrifying casualness, wielding their walking sticks like extensions of their authority. They would stop before a line of stock, using the silver-tipped ends of their canes to lift a chin or poke a rib, testing the resilience of the product without deigning to make skin-to-skin contact. They discussed the merchandise in the same flat, transactional language one might use to evaluate a carriage horse or a bale of cotton. They looked for strong backs for the cane fields, nimble fingers for the cotton bolls, and breeding hips for the future expansion of their workforce. The inspection was a violation so routine that it had lost its power to shock anyone but the victims, who stood frozen, stripped of agency, forced to endure the poking and prodding of strangers who held the power of life and death in their gloved hands. However, there was a specific corner of this market, a niche of high-value luxury goods, where the cynicism of the era reached its absolute zenith. This was the domain of the fancy trade, a euphemism that barely concealed the sexual predation at its core. Here, the merchandise was not valued for its ability to harvest crops or haul timber, but for its aesthetic proximity to the white ideal. The fancy girls, and occasionally boys, were the mixed-race children of the plantation aristocracy, the products of that open secret which everyone knew and no one acknowledged. They were separated from the field hands, dressed in silks and ribbons rather than burlap, and displayed like rare, exotic birds. The girls, often no older than 14 or 15, stood on raised platforms, their hair brushed to a shine and their faces scrubbed clean. They were the quadroons and octoroons, terms that quantified their blood with the precision of a chemical formula. The buyers in this section were not looking for labor, they were looking for concubines, for domestic ornaments, for victims to populate the clandestine harems of the city or the lonely bedrooms of isolated plantations. The atmosphere here was thicker, charged with a lust that was barely masked by the pretense of commerce. The men lingered longer, their inspections more intrusive, their questions more intimate. They asked about the girl's temperament, her training, and her health, codes for her sexual compliance and durability. In this grotesque theater, the light skin of the victims, a trait inherited directly from their white fathers, did not serve as a shield. On the contrary, it was their primary selling point, the feature that drove the bidding war into the thousands of dollars. It was a tragic irony of biblical proportions, the very features that should have signaled kinship and demanded protection, the father's nose, the grandmother's smile, the specific blue of the family eyes, were transformed into marketing assets. The auctioneers, men with voices like carnival barkers, would extol these features, shouting to the crowd about the fine texture of the hair, and the alabaster quality of the skin, explicitly selling the whiteness of the child to the highest bidder. The father, the men who had engaged in the initial act of creation and the subsequent act of betrayal, often stood on the periphery of this scene. He was the vendor, the man whose debts were being settled by the sale of his own genetic legacy. He watched as other men, his peers and social equals, inspected his daughter with hungry eyes. He saw them touch her face, check her teeth, and comment on her figure. A normal human response would be a murderous rage, a primal instinct to defend one's offspring from predation. But the plantation economy had successfully surgically removed this instinct, replacing it with the numbness of necessity. The father did not see a daughter being molested by the gaze of the crowd, he saw a high-yield asset generating interest. He suppressed the nausea of conscience with the cold logic that she would fetch a good price and therefore have a better life as a house servant than as a field hand, a lie he repeated until it hardened into truth. The child, standing on the block, experienced a disorientation that was absolute. They looked out at the sea of faces, searching for the one face that mattered, the face that was mirrored in their own. They saw the father, but he was not looking at them. He was looking at the auctioneer, or at the ledger in his hand, or at the exit. The realization that their whiteness was a trap rather than a key was a slow, crushing weight. They had grown up perhaps hearing whispers of their lineage, perhaps harboring a secret hope that their blood would save them from the auction block. Now, they understood that their blood was the very reason they were standing there. They were too white to be left in the fields, too black to be free, and beautiful enough to be coveted as a trophy. The buyers of fancy stock were often men of significant wealth, for the prices commanded by these children were astronomical. $2,000, $3,000, sometimes more, sums that could purchase a small farm or a skilled blacksmith. This high price point created a perverse psychology of ownership. The buyer felt that because he had paid a fortune for this human being, he was entitled to extract every ounce of value from them, whether that value was labor or pleasure. The transaction validated his dominance. He was buying a status symbol, a living proof that he could afford the finest stock the South had to offer. The pale skin of the slave was a testament to his purchasing power, a luxury item that signaled his ascendancy over both the market and the moral law. The inspection process for these fancy lots was a ritual of humiliation designed to extinguish any lingering spark of personhood within the victim. The buyers would demand that the girl turn slowly, pirouetting on the wooden platform so that they might assess her figure from every angle, critiquing her proportions with the loud, boisterous confidence of men who knew their opinions were law. They would run their hands over her arms to test the firmness of the flesh, effectively checking the merchandise for defects before committing their capital. If a girl flinched or pulled away, it was noted as a flaw in her temperament, a sign of uppity behavior that would require breaking, and the price might dip accordingly. Therefore, the child learned in seconds to stand as still as a statue, to hold her breath, and to disassociate from her own body, retreating into a deep, dark corner of her mind while strangers mapped the geography of her skin with their calloused fingers. At the center of this storm stood the auctioneer, the high priest of the rotunda, a man whose voice was a finely tuned instrument of commerce. He was a performer, a carnival barker in a silk vest, whose job was to whip the crowd into a frenzy of competitive spending. He knew exactly how to pitch the specific lot standing beside him. He did not sell a human being, he sold a fantasy, a bundle of potential services and pleasures. He would gesture theatrically to the girl's pale complexion, using it as the anchor of his sales pitch. He would shout about her aristocratic bearing, her refined features, and her gentle disposition, framing her not as a victim of incestuous neglect, but as a luxury acquisition suitable for the finest parlors. The auctioneer's patter was a hypnotic rhythm, a fast-paced chant designed to bypass the conscience and tap directly into the wallet and the ID of the buyer. He managed to make the purchase of a person seem like a refined gentleman's pursuit, stripping away the brutality and leaving only the allure of exclusivity. He made the men in the room feel that by bidding, they were demonstrating their taste and their capacity to appreciate quality, even when that quality was defined by the rape of a subordinate. The air in the rotunda grew hot and stifling as the bidding war commenced, the atmosphere thickening with the competitive ego of the gathered men. The numbers began to fly through the cigar smoke, $800, $1,000, $1,200. Each shout was a fresh blow to the child's identity, a public declaration of how much her life was worth to a stranger. The father stood by, listening to the escalating figures with a heart that beat not with anxiety for his child's future, but with the thrill of a gambler watching a winning horse cross the finish line. In the rising price, he saw the liquidation of his gambling debts, he saw the new mahogany furniture for the drawing room, he saw the preservation of his social standing. The voice of the blood was drowned out completely by the voice of the market. Culmination arrived with the sharp, cracking sound of the gavel striking the podium. That noise, dry and percussive like a pistol shot, acted as a sonic guillotine. It was the definitive moment of severance, the point where biology was legally overruled by contract law. "Sold," cried the auctioneer, pointing his hammer at the winner, a man who grinned with the satisfaction of someone who has just secured a rare vintage wine. In that split second, the tension in the father's shoulders released. He let out a breath he had been holding, a sigh not of sorrow, but of relief. The danger of having the evidence around the house was gone, the asset had been successfully monetized. The look he exchanged with the auctioneer was one of professional mutual respect, a nod between two men who understood the grim necessities of business. The aftermath of the sale was a bureaucratic anticlimax, a shuffling of papers in a small office off the main floor. The father walked to the clerk's desk to finalize the transaction, leaving the child standing on the block to be claimed by the new owner's handlers. He signed the bill of sale with a steady hand, the scratch of the quill on parchment serving as the final signature on his betrayal. He accepted the payment, a stack of bank notes or a draft on a solvent bank, and tucked it into his coat pocket. He patted the pocket, feeling the physical weight of the money against his ribs, right where his heart should have been. The transformation was complete, the living, breathing result of his own loins had been alchemically transmuted into paper and ink. As the father stepped out of the St. Louis hotel and into the blinding glare of the New Orleans afternoon, he adjusted his hat and checked his pocket watch. The world had not ended, the sky had not turned black. Life continued with an indifferent, sunny cheerfulness. He felt lighter, unburdened by the presence of the child who had looked too much like him. He would go to a cafe now, perhaps enjoy a bowl of gumbo and a glass of wine, telling himself that he had done what was necessary to save the family estate. Behind him, inside the dim, cavernous rotunda, his son or daughter was being shackled for transport to a new nightmare, their last view of their father being the back of his coat disappearing through the heavy oak doors, walking away into a freedom purchased with their soul. The culmination of this tragic theater arrived not with a whimper, but with the rhythmic, hypnotic cadence of the auctioneer's chant, a sound that served as the heartbeat of the Southern economy. The moment the auctioneer's gavel was raised into the stagnant air of the rotunda, time seemed to undergo a grotesque dilation, stretching the seconds into hours of agonizing clarity. The child stood upon the raised wooden platform, isolated and exposed, elevated above the crowd like a sacrificial offering on a pagan altar. They were stripped of all privacy and dignity, exhibited to the world with the same clinical detachment one might apply to a prize stallion or a broodmare at a county fair. The humidity in the room was stifling, a physical weight that pressed against the lungs, carrying the scent of men's sweat, stale tobacco smoke, and the metallic tang of fear that radiated from the holding pens. For the child, the world had narrowed down to this terrifying pedestal. Every protective layer of childhood had been peeled away, leaving them raw and trembling under the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes. They could feel the gaze of the buyers physically, like a swarm of insects crawling over their skin. These men, respectable pillars of their communities with Bibles in their pockets and cruelty in their hearts, did not see a terrified adolescent, they saw a speculative asset. They assessed the curvature of the spine, the clarity of the complexion, and the soundness of the teeth, calculating the potential return on investment with the cold precision of an actuary. The child stood frozen, paralyzed by a biological terror that went deeper than thought, the primal instinct of prey realizing it has been cornered in an open field with nowhere to run. In this suspended moment, amidst the rising roar of voices and the aggressive shouting of bids, a silent dialogue began to play out, a conversation far more devastating than any scream or plea for mercy. The victim, with a desperate, frantic energy, searched the sea of faces for the one anchor they had in this storm. The son looked for the father. The daughter looked for the men who had sat at the head of the dinner table, the men whose blood coursed through her veins. It was an instinctual search for protection, a naive belief that the laws of nature, the bond between parent and offspring, must surely hold more power than the laws of commerce. They sought the familiar silhouette, the specific tilt of the hat, the known posture of the men who had brought them into this world. When the child finally locked eyes with the father, the tragedy crystallized into its purest, most brutal form. The eyes that stared back at the planter were often mirrors of his own. They were the same watery blue of the Tidewater aristocracy, or the piercing steel gray of the Scots-Irish settlers, or the warm hazel that had been passed down through generations of free white men. In those eyes, wide with panic and brimming with unshed tears, there was a final, dying hope. It was a silent interrogation, a plea that asked, "Do you not see yourself in me? Am I not your flesh? How can you trade your own reflection for paper money?" It was the last stand of humanity against the machinery of the market, a soul begging to be acknowledged as something more than a line item in a ledger. But the father did not look back in the way the child hoped. He did not step forward to stop the proceedings, he did not crumble in shame, he did not avert his gaze in sorrow. Instead, he looked through the child. He looked past the terrifying familiarity of those eyes and focused intensely on the auctioneer. In his mind, a formidable psychological wall had been erected, a barrier built of necessity and greed that allowed him to separate the biological reality from the economic imperative. He forced himself to see not a son, but a commodity. He was not listening to the silent scream of his blood, he was listening to the music of the numbers. The numbers were the only thing that mattered now. They were the melody that would soothe his financial anxieties and justify this betrayal. The auctioneer, a man with the charisma of a preacher and the soul of a jackal, whipped the crowd into a frenzy. His voice rose and fell, a rapid-fire staccato that bypassed the intellect and tapped directly into the competitive ego of the buyers. $800, he shouted, pointing a finger into the crowd. I have 800, do I hear 9? Look at the breeding, gentlemen. Look at the complexion. Raised in the house, not the field. A prime article. The father listened to these words not as an insult to his progeny, but as a validation of his product. $800 was a significant sum, enough to pay the interest on the bank loan for another quarter. But he wanted more. He needed more. He stood rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped the lapels of his coat, mentally willing the price to climb higher. $900. $1,000. The bids flew through the air like invisible arrows, each one striking the child with the force of a physical blow. With every increase in price, the child's status as a human being diminished, and their status as a luxury object solidified. $1,000 was a fortune, a sum that could buy a small farm, a carriage, and a team of horses. To be valued at such a price was a perverse compliment, it meant the child was considered an exquisite specimen of potential labor or pleasure. For the father, the number 1,000 sounded like salvation. It meant that the problem of the mixed-race child was not only being removed but was paying a handsome dividend upon its exit. He watched the bidders with a critical, predatory eye, silently cheering on the men who were fighting to own his flesh and blood. The tension in the rotunda grew electric as the bidding war narrowed down to 2 or 3 determined men. The air crackled with the friction of male egos clashing over ownership. 1,100. 1,200. The numbers spiraled upward, defying gravity and morality alike. The child, standing on the block, felt a wave of dizziness, the room spinning around them in a blur of noise and color. They saw the father nod almost imperceptibly at a high bid, a gesture of approval that felt like a knife in the heart. That nod confirmed the ultimate abandonment. It signaled that the father was not a reluctant participant coerced by circumstance, but an active partner in the transaction. He was rooting for the sale. He was negotiating the exchange rate of his own DNA. The sounds of the room merged into a deafening cacophony, the shouting of the auctioneer, the murmurs of the spectators, the shuffling of feet, and the blood pounding in the child's ears. 1,200, going once. The father held his breath. This was the moment of maximum risk and maximum reward. If the bidding stopped now, he would be solvent. If it went higher, he would be rich. He calculated the commission, the travel expenses, and the net profit in a split second. The human element had been completely incinerated by the heat of the deal. There was no room for sentimentality in the arithmetic of survival. He was a farmer harvesting a crop, and the fact that the crop could weep and speak was merely an inconvenience to be ignored. Going twice. The auctioneer's voice boomed, suspended in the air like a thunderclap. The child looked at the father one last time, a gaze that would haunt the darkest corners of the man's conscience in the years to come, or perhaps would be dismissed with a stiff drink and a shrug. In that final second, the child saw the truth: they were alone. The universe was indifferent, and their father was a stranger who happened to share their face. The hope in their eyes died, replaced by a cold, hard numbness. They were no longer a person, they were a lot number, a purchase, a thing to be crated and shipped. The rejection was absolute. The silence between them was a chasm that could never be bridged. Then, the hammer fell. The sound of the gavel striking the wooden podium was sharp, decisive, and violent. Crack. It was the sound of a bone breaking. It was the sound of a coffin lid slamming shut. It echoed through the rotunda, cutting through the noise and bringing a sudden, shocking finality to the proceedings. That sound marked the precise moment of legal death for the child and financial rebirth for the father. The bond of blood was severed not by a sword, but by a piece of polished oak. The transaction was sealed. The deed was done. The laws of the state had formally recognized the transfer of title from the progenitor to the purchaser. At the sound of the hammer, the father let out a long, shuddering breath. It was a profound exhale, the air rushing out of his lungs in a gust of released tension. But let there be no mistake, this was not a sigh of regret. It was not the sound of a heart breaking. It was the sound of relief. It was the physical reaction of a businessman who has just closed a difficult and risky deal. He exhaled because the uncertainty was over. He exhaled because the price was higher than he had anticipated in his most optimistic projections. $1,200. That was the number that danced in his head. He did not think of the hell into which he had just sent his child, he thought of the liquidity he had just secured. The father's shoulders relaxed, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth, not a smile of joy, but of grim satisfaction. He adjusted his cuffs, smoothing the fabric of his coat. The ugliness of the auction was fading, replaced by the warm glow of profit. He turned his eyes away from the podium, away from the child who was now being roughly handled by the new owner's agents, shackled and led away like a stubborn mule. He did not need to look at them anymore. They were no longer his problem. They were someone else's property. The ledger was balanced. The secret shame was gone, converted into clean, crisp bank notes. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of other men, exchanging nods of professional courtesy. He was still a gentleman. He was still a respected member of society. The barbaric act he had just committed was woven so seamlessly into the fabric of his culture that it required no apology. He had simply done what was necessary. He had pruned the family tree to ensure its survival. As the next lot was brought up to the block, perhaps another man's daughter, another man's sin, the father turned on his heel and walked toward the clerk's table to collect his earnings. The coldness in the room was not the temperature of the air, it was the absolute zero of a human heart that had learned to monetize its own beating rhythm. The aftermath of the auction did not bring thunder from the heavens or a sudden crack in the earth to swallow the sinner's whole. Instead, the world simply continued to turn with a terrifying, mechanical indifference. The gavel's echo faded into the ambient noise of the hotel rotunda, replaced by the scratching of quill pens and the clinking of crystal glasses in the adjacent bar. For the father, the immediate sensation was not one of crushing guilt, but of a strange, narcotic lightness. The heavy, suffocating presence of his own indiscretion had been physically removed from his orbit. He stood at the clerk's desk, watching the counting of the bank notes, the crisp, green paper rustling like dry leaves. This money, warm from the friction of the market, was the alchemical residue of his child. It was clean, it was legal, and it carried no scent of the fear that had saturated the air only moments before. The transaction was complete, and the ledgers of the universe, at least in his mind, were balanced. With the proceeds of the sale tucked securely into his breast pocket, resting against the very heart that should have broken but did not, the planter stepped out into the blinding New Orleans afternoon. The city was alive with commerce and vice, a churning organism that consumed lives and excreted gold. The father did not flee this scene in shame, rather, he embraced it with the renewed vigor of a man who has just been granted a financial reprieve. The money burning a hole in his pocket was not treated as blood money, to be hoarded or donated in penance. It was treated as found capital, a sudden windfall that required immediate circulation to demonstrate his restored solvency. The first stop was often the gaming tables or the private clubs where his debts of honor had accumulated like silt in a stagnant river. He walked into the smoky, dimly lit rooms of the gambling dens, placing the fresh bank notes on the green baize with a flourish. There was a grotesque irony in this act. The freedom of his son or daughter had been sold to pay for the father's enslavement to chance and cards. He paid off the grim-faced creditors who had been holding his promissory notes, men who knew exactly where the money came from and did not care in the slightest. The debt was settled, the handshake was firm, and the gentleman's honor was restored. The social fabric of the South was knit together by such transactions, a tapestry where the threads were spun from human misery. He ordered a round of drinks for the house, toasting to luck and prosperity, while the ghost of the child he had just liquidated stood unseen in the corner, dissolving into the cigar smoke. The spending spree did not end at the card table. The domestic economy of the plantation required maintenance, and the wife back home needed to be appeased. The father visited the finest emporiums on Canal Street, shops that smelled of lavender and imported spices. He ran his calloused fingers over bolts of French silk and patterns of intricate lace, searching for a peace offering for the woman who had demanded the exile of his illegitimate offspring. He selected a dress pattern of the deepest crimson or the purest white, purchasing it with the very funds generated by the sale of the child who had been the source of her jealousy. The silk rustled softly, a whisper of luxury that would soon drape the body of his lawful wife, acting as a second skin to cover the rot of their marriage. He moved on to the furniture makers, admiring the dark, polished surfaces of mahogany and rosewood. He needed a new dining table, or perhaps a set of high-backed chairs to replace the ones that had grown shabby. He imagined the new furniture in his parlor, glowing under the light of the chandelier. He did not let himself think about the fact that the wood was being paid for by flesh. He did not visualize the sturdy legs of the table as the transmuted bones of his son. He simply saw an upgrade to his lifestyle, a necessary acquisition to maintain the facade of the successful patriarch. The child had been an abstract liability, the table was a concrete asset. The exchange made perfect economic sense to a mind that had severed the connection between biology and morality. While the father shopped for luxuries, the subject of the sale was beginning their descent into the abyss. The child, now stripped of their name and their history, was being processed into the vast, anonymous machinery of the Deep South. If it was a boy, he was likely already in chains, being marched onto a steamboat bound for the sugar parishes of Louisiana or the cotton hells of Mississippi. He was no longer a person, he was a unit of labor, a machine made of muscle and bone expected to operate until failure. He would vanish into the endless green rows of the cane fields, where the sun beat down with the weight of a hammer and the machetes flashed in the humid air. His life expectancy was now measured in harvest cycles, his body destined to be broken by the relentless demand for sugar and cotton. If the child was a girl, particularly one of the fancy class who had fetched a high price, her destination was a different kind of hell. She was not bound for the fields, but for the gilded cages of the city's demimonde. She would be taken to a townhouse with velvet curtains and soft beds, where she would learn that her survival depended on her ability to submit to the whims of the men who had purchased her. Her beauty, the very trait inherited from her father, had become her prison. She would be dressed in the finest clothes, perhaps even the same silk her father had just bought for his wife, and paraded as a trophy. Her spirit would be ground down by the friction of constant, enforced intimacy, her will eroded until she was nothing more than a porcelain doll that breathed and bled. She would learn to smile when ordered, to pour wine with a steady hand, and to endure the nights with a dissociation so profound it mimicked death. In the end, she would vanish just as completely as her brother in the fields, swallowed by the voracious appetite of a society that consumed beauty and strength with equal indifference, leaving behind only the silence of a ledger entry marked "paid in full." While the children dissolved into the anonymity of their new wretched existence, the father began his journey back to the plantation. The return trip was markedly different from the journey down. The wagon was lighter, the springs no longer groaning under the weight of human cargo. The air seemed clearer to him, stripped of the tension that had accompanied the presence of his illegitimate offspring. He rode with the easy, relaxed posture of a man who has successfully lanced a boil. The landscape of the South, with its moss-draped oaks and sluggish bayous, no longer looked like a prison but like a kingdom he had successfully defended. He smoked a cigar, watching the smoke curl into the evening sky, feeling a sense of accomplishment. He had navigated the treacherous waters of finance and family politics and had emerged with his wallet full and his domestic peace secured. As he turned onto the long, tree-lined avenue that led to his home, the setting sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns. The white columns of the big house gleamed in the twilight, a symbol of order, civilization, and permanence. To the casual observer, or to the history books that would later sanitize this era, it was a scene of pastoral beauty. But to the historian peeling back the layers of rot, it was a monument built on a foundation of bones. The planter directed the carriage to the front steps, where a groom, another piece of property, perhaps one who had known the child just sold, rushed to take the horses. The father stepped down, his boots crunching on the gravel, the sound echoing the finality of the gabble he had heard days before. He dusted off his coat, checked his cravat, and prepared to re-enter the role of the benevolent patriarch. The reunion with his wife was a masterpiece of unspoken communication. She met him in the foyer or on the veranda, her face a mask of carefully constructed neutrality. She did not ask where the child was, she did not need to. The absence was the answer. The silence where a child's laughter or footsteps used to be was the confirmation she desired. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, a gesture that was cold and performative. Then, he produced the package from New Orleans. The wrapping paper crinkled as he handed it to her, a sound that filled the quiet space between them. She opened it to reveal the bolt of silk or the lace shawl, the tangible fruit of their betrayal. Her eyes lit up, not with love, but with the satisfaction of acquisition. She ran her hands over the fabric, admiring its texture, willfully ignoring the fact that she was touching the transmuted skin of her husband's child. In accepting the gift, she became a co-conspirator, her silence bought and paid for with a few yards of expensive cloth. Life on the plantation resumed its rhythmic, grinding normality with terrifying speed. The gap in the workforce or the household staff was filled by reshuffling other slaves, the organic machinery of the estate adjusting to the loss of a gear. The name of the sold child was never spoken again. It was excised from the collective memory of the White family with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. If a visitor or a naive relative asked about the little yellow boy who used to run the errands, a smooth, practiced lie was ready. He ran off, the planter would say with a sigh of feigned disappointment, or, the fever took him, poor creature. The lie was delivered with such conviction that the speaker almost believed it himself. It was a necessary fiction, a layer of varnish applied to the rough wood of reality to keep the illusion of benevolence intact. The true culmination of this horror, however, was not in the fields or the slave markets, but in the dining room. Picture the scene, a long table of polished mahogany, likely the very one purchased or refurbished with the blood money. The room is bathed in the warm, golden glow of candlelight, reflected in the silver cutlery and the crystal goblets. The air smells of roast beef, rich gravy, and freshly baked bread, the aromas of abundance and civilization. The planter sits at the head of the table, the undisputed master of his domain. To his right sits his wife, wearing the new silk dress that rustles softly as she moves. Around them sit their legitimate children, the heirs to the empire, their faces bright and clean, their futures secure and paved with gold. They are laughing, protected, and loved, their very existence subsidized by the brother or sister who is currently shivering in a cold shed hundreds of miles away. The patriarch rings a small silver bell, and a servant enters to pour the wine. The wine is a deep, rich red, a vintage imported from France, paid for with the surplus cash from the trip to New Orleans. The father lifts the glass, swirling the liquid, admiring its color. He takes a sip, and the taste is sweet on his tongue. He does not taste the sweat of the auction block, he does not taste the salt of his son's tears. He tastes only the success of his management. He looks down the table at his family, a tableau of American success, and feels a swell of pride. He has provided for them. He has done what a father is supposed to do, according to the twisted definitions of his time and place. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this moment is staggering, a mental fortress so thick that no arrow of conscience can pierce it. Then comes the final, crowning act of hypocrisy. Before the meal begins, the room falls silent. The father clears his throat and bows his head. The wife and the children follow suit, clasping their hands in prayer. The planter begins to speak, his voice deep and resonant, the voice of a man who believes he is on intimate terms with the Almighty. Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which we are about to receive from thy bounty. The words hang in the air, grotesque and heavy. He thanks God for the food, for the roof over their heads, for the prosperity of the land. He prays for guidance and for the continued health of his family. He invokes the name of a just and loving God to sanctify a feast bought with the betrayal of his own flesh. This prayer is the seal on the coffin of his humanity. It is the moment where the moral universe collapses completely. To thank the Creator for gifts purchased through the destruction of one of his creations is a blasphemy so profound it defies description. Yet, it was a scene played out in thousands of dining rooms across the South and the emerging West every single night. It was the ritual that normalized the horror, wrapping the wolf of greed in the sheep's clothing of piety. The Amen that followed was not a conclusion to a prayer, but a collective agreement to forget, to ignore, and to consume. The family lifted their heads, smiled at one another, and picked up their forks, cutting into the meat with the easy grace of predators who have forgotten they are predators. This monstrous capacity for compartmentalization, this ability to shut off the flow of empathy the moment it threatened the bottom line, became the bedrock of the nation's expansion. The Wild West was not tamed by the lone hero on a horse, it was conquered by the same cold, mercantile logic that governed the auction block. The railroads that sliced through the plains, the mines that gutted the mountains, and the towns that sprang up from the dust were all fueled by a capital that had been washed in blood. The ethos of the plantation, that people are resources, that nature is an enemy to be broken, and that profit justifies any method, did not die with the Civil War. It migrated. It evolved. It seeped into the groundwater of the American psyche. The child sold in the rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel did not just disappear into the cotton fields, they disappeared into the foundation of the American dream. They became the invisible rebar reinforcing the concrete of a society obsessed with growth and status. When we look back at the glory of the expansion era, at the fortunes made and the empires built, we must force ourselves to see the ghost in the room. We must see the father sitting at the head of the table, wiping wine from his lips, while his son rots in an unmarked grave in the Delta. We must understand that the self-made man, that great idol of Western history, was often a man who cannibalized his own kin to survive. The story does not end with a moral lesson or a divine retribution. The planter likely lived a long life, dying in his bed surrounded by weeping grandchildren who remembered him as a kind and generous soul. His tombstone probably bears an inscription about honor and duty. The child he sold likely died young, broken by labor or disease, buried in a patch of earth that no one remembers. There is no justice in this narrative, only the cold, hard truth of how the West was truly won. It was won by men who could look into the eyes of their own children, see a price tag, and feel nothing but the satisfaction of a good deal. That silence, that terrible, echoing silence of the father's heart, is the true soundtrack of the era, a sound that rings louder than any gunshot in the history of the frontier.